Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another deep deck overview. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below, especially what deck you might like to see next. This is one of the premier combo decks in the format with the banning of Winota. Obviously there are other true combo decks in the format like Lotus Field combo, but this deck can go off as early as turn 3. If you can manage to get a Parhelion into the graveyard and then cast a Greasefang, you can often attack for 13 power on turn 3 and leave 2 4/4 angels behind that your opponent also has to deal with. Greasefang is obviously the key to this deck. It's the beginning of your combat on your turn. Return target vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield, gains haste. Return it to the owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. This is kind of like the old Abzan or Junk Reanimator decks that used to permeate standard formats of many yesteryear in the Return to Ravnica meta. They use things like Burial Rates to get things like an Angel of Sanctity and back. Instead, you're doing vehicles that leave other tokens behind, either Esika's Chariot or Parhelion. One of the things that's different about this version, as opposed to the Esper or the Mardu variants that we might cover at another point in time, is this deck doesn't have a ton of discard effects from hand. It's more of a self-mill thing. It tries to fill the graveyard with effects like Stitcher Supplier milling over 3, Satyr Wayfinder milling over 4 and getting you a land back, Grizzly Salvage, kind of the key linchpin of this deck, where you reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature or land among them into your hand and put the rest in your graveyard. This helps with both trying to find mana, as you don't run a lot of lands in this deck, and also helps with finding your Greasefang and flipping over your vehicles in the graveyard. Another key card to this is the modal card Witherbloom Command. It allows target player to mill 3 cards and then you return a land from your graveyard to your hand. Or you can destroy a non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. Great against a lot of the hate cards you might see in post-board games, things like Unlicensed Hearse and Rest in Peace. Target creature gets -3/-1 until end of turn. This can kill some things, though not a lot in the format. It can often kill like a mana dork or something out of mono green. And then target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Nice way to hedge against aggressive decks a little bit and also burn your opponent out once you've dealt with the main blows of damage with either Esika's Chariots or Parhelions. Another huge addition to this version, being the green variant as opposed to the Mardu or the Esper variants, is instead of playing Parhelion and Sky Sovereign, you get to play a mid-range threat in Esika's Chariot that you can often just hardcast. This is a threat that forces your opponent to deal with it, and much like its introduction into the Winota deck before its banning, made the deck significantly more of a mid-range threat as opposed to just being a combo deck, and forces your opponent to respect your B-game backup plan of beating them down, and then gives you a chance to resolve Greasefang to potentially put a Parhelion into play. Beyond that, you're just playing the good black and white cards. You're playing things like Thoughtseize, and as well as Fatal Push in the sideboards, a lot of these lists. Thoughtseize allows you to kind of poke apart your opponent's hand, potentially find a hole in it to be able to resolve your combo and get them dead. Or you can alternatively, you can also use Thoughtseize to put a Parhelion from your hand into the graveyard to be able to reanimate with a Greasefang. And then finally, you have copies of Can't Stay Away, which is a 2-mana sorcery that allows you to return target creature 3 or less to the graveyard to the battlefield, and it just happens to have the text, if this creature would die, exile it instead, and it has flashback for 3, a black and white. So this kind of allows you to have the Unburial Rites-esque effect of, if you happen to mill over this card, cast it from your graveyard. Now 5 mana is a little bit slower than obviously casting a Greasefang on 3, but it still gives you some amount of inevitability if your opponent can't deal with your graveyard. Another important piece to this deck is Rafine's Informant, which is a 2/1 that connives, which allows you to discard your vehicles that are in your hand, or if you happen to maybe have multiple copies of Greasefang, you can loot those away and then bring it back with a Can't Stay Away. So that's pretty much what the main deck's trying to do. You're this self-mill deck that's trying to combo your opponent with either an Esika's Chariot or preferably a Parhelion and get them dead. And you have this kind of slow, mopey, beatdown backup plan of Rafine's Informant, Satyr Wayfinder, and Esika's Chariot if your opponent happens to be able to cut off the graveyard, especially in game number 1. And then Greasefang is not a terrible beatdown threat on its own as a 4/3 for 3 mana. Sideboard, you're kind of trying to answer what your opponent's doing while also having a little bit of a juke. You have things like Graveyard Trespasser as just a good value card. Also happens to be a decent hate card in the mirror match and against the Is It Phoenix decks varieties. Unlicensed Hearse, primarily there for those same matchups, the other Greasefang decks, and also against the Is It Spell-based decks. Abrupt Decay often allows you to deal with hate cards that your opponent might bring in, similar to Witherbloom Command, while also helping to stem the tide against other aggressive decks like Mono Red and the Humans decks, and Spirits, and being uncounterable, kind of particularly relevant against Mono Blue Spirits. Fatal Push, just a good solid interaction against opponents' aggressive decks, and then Duress gives you additional discard spells to pair with your Thoughtseizes to kind of clear the way from your opponent stopping your combo. And then Sky Sovereign, a card you might bring in against creature-based matchups, as its deal 3 damage to target creature is quite relevant, and they can also help clear out Planeswalkers, allowing you to deal with that sometimes might be difficult to deal with if your opponent can come up the board against your particular strategy. One of the alternatives that variants you might see is this version's a little bit more mid-range based and a little lot less in on the combo. Doesn't have as much self-mill. You're not running the any copies of Stitcher Supplier or anything. Instead, you're just running Seder Wayfinder, one copy of Grizzly Salvage, and you're just kind of playing this value game where you kind of lean more into a Seeker's Chariot being a good 4-drop, and then you're playing things like Tireless Tracker, Greasefang, and Graveyard Trespasser to kind of force your opponent to respect your beatdown plan a little bit more, and then you still have this backup plan of being able to combo them, kill them with a Parhelion or a hasty Asika's Chariot. This version also happens to be running Traverse the Evenwall to be able to find various different creatures. Now there isn't a ton of ways to turn on things, but with obviously having artifacts in your deck, and being able to mill over lands, it's not too hard to turn on Traverse. All you gotta do is get a creature and some type of other spell into the graveyard. So this is a nice way to have this little bit of a Traverse package in addition to being more of a mid-range shell, and you're still playing, one Can't Stay Away. You get to play one copy of Vanishing Verse and one copy of Abrupt Decay. You're kind of picking and choosing these different spells, and then you get to play the Fatal Push Thoughtseize combo that's prevalent in much of these black mid-range decks. The sideboard, obviously a little bit different as you're not as all in on the combo, so you're more of an Abzan mid-range deck that just happens to be playing in the combo. Play things like Extinction Event against other creature-based decks, Go Blank and Duress against combo and control decks, Archon of Emeria and Deafening Silence, very good against the Izzet spell-based decks, as well as the Lotus Field combo decks. You have Noxious Grasp for mono green in particular, also can come in against blue-white control against a lot of their planeswalkers. Unlicensed Hearse we've already covered. Abrupt Decay, once again, very good against killing a lot of early creatures, as well as a lot of the anti-hate cards. And then Vanishing Verse, once again, also answers a lot of the hate cards, while also being good against those. Scavenging Ooze is a nice one of, can be a graveyard hate piece while also being a certain amount of inevitability in the creature-based matchups. And then Crawl Harpooner, nice traverse target against spirits and angels-based decks. The final version we're looking at is a little bit different than the first, although it's very similar. This is more of the self-mill combo deck, but it shaved a couple copies of Stitcher Supplier for a couple copies of Tasigur. Tasigur is quite a nice mid-range threat in these Abzan piles, especially since you're already putting a bunch of cards in the graveyard. You can often cast this for 1 mana on turn 3, while also holding up some type of interaction, or say a Grizzly Salvage or a Witherbloom command. So once again, putting the stress on your opponent to answer your B plan backup of beating them down, giving you a chance to resolve your combo and kill them. But, much like the old Abzan Reanimator decks, as I kind of referred to before, this is a deck that is a decent fair deck that also happens to have this graveyard value plan that can just kill you. So it can be a very stressful deck to play against, although the graveyard hate that exists in the format is often enough to keep it in check. It's a very powerful entity in the Explorer format where things are a little bit weaker, but has yet to really crest as a Tier 1 option in the Pioneer format. Sideboard is largely the same sideboard you saw on the first deck, so there isn't a lot of iterating that has gone on with this list. I wanted to point out the mid-range list because I found that to be the most interesting, as opposed to most people were just kind of copying and pasting the original list that I believe came in second, or maybe either came in second or first at one of the challenges, and that kind of put the deck on the map. There had been a few 5-0s before that point in time, but it's been largely the same list floating around other than that one mid-range list that we pointed out. One thing, like I said, that this version is kind of different than the Esper and Mardu variants is you're a little bit more on self-mill. You kind of get this value engine plan going with your mill, while you also get to play a Seeker's Chariot, which is an excellent secondary threat to Parhelion. Just kind of forces your opponent to respect your combo, but also respect your mid-range beatdown plan. Something that proved very effective for Winota in its waning days before it was banned. Seeka's Chariot gave you this other 4-drop that your opponent had to deal with. If your opponent was just sitting back on a bunch of removal hoping to kill your key combo piece, oftentimes you could just outvalue them by casting a Seeka's Chariots and 12-floor Wolfmasters. This deck is very much the same way. In terms of, the Seeka's Chariots and, your Raffine's Informants and stuff can be beating you down when you're trying to hold up removal for their Greasefang, and all of a sudden they're able to cast Greasefang after you've had to cast a sweeper to deal with their board, and then you get hit with a Parhelion out of nowhere and kind of lose the game. This is always one of the best combo deck things, in my opinion, is a deck that can have a solid plan B to force your opponent to react to that, and then hit you with the plan A and just kind of win the game. As far as this deck's place in the meta, it's really hard to not like a deck that can kill you on, or basically kill you on turn 3 with the combo, while also having interaction in the form of Thoughtseize and Duress against a lot of the combo decks. So this is a deck that can do very well against other creature-based decks, but can struggle against decks that can go over the top of it quickly enough, or interact with it on enough axes. For instance, Blue-White Control with Rest in Pieces out of the sideboard can be particularly difficult if you can't steal game number 1. Mono green can sometimes overpower what you're doing if you can't find the combo quickly enough. And then, obviously the tempo decks like mono blue spirits, Bant spirits, and the various Izzet decks can have just enough interaction to be able to beat you. So this deck is not as unflappable as a deck like Winota, mostly because Winota wasn't reliant on the graveyard. This deck has that element of both graveyard hate and removal serve very nice purposes against the main form of the combo, but this deck, much like Winota, does have a resilient game plan B to beat you down. So it is a deck you need to be aware of, and I do think that the Abzan variants have proven to be the most resilient and powerful so far, and maybe will be enough to get this deck to tier 1 in the format, to challenge its other decks like red-black midrange, blue-white control, mono-green, and mono-blue spirits, among other decks that have rotated in and out of tier 1 in the Pioneer format. So this is a deck that you should be aware of, and you might see it popping up more and more. You also need to be aware of the Mardu and Esper variants that we will cover in different videos. Thank you for tuning in to this video. This has been John for Pioneer Nexus MTG. Don't forget to let me know in the comments what deck you might like to see next.